Good afternoon, and thanks for the opportunity. I was glad to be invited to say a few words. If you find I talk a little bit fast, I need to explain. I grew up in a large family. Mom and Dad had 9 kids, and they found 3 extra ones over and above that needed homes. So, with 12 kids, when you got a chance to talk, you talk fast. So if I talk a little bit fast, that's where it comes from. I'm Deputy Minister with the Nunatsiavut Government in Labrador, and prior to that I worked with the Labrador Inuit Association. So I've been, I'm not sure how many years I got in, not as many as my co-worker Lucy Brennan. She's our Director of Post-Secondary Education. She's been there longer than I have, but I've got about 24, 25 years, and so some experience there. What I want to do is just very briefly, what I'll do is I'll just take you through very quickly the Nunatsiavut Government, where it came from, and the departments we have set up. Then I'd like to talk just a few minutes about some engagements we've had with MUN in the past, because I think we can probably learn something from them. And then I'll sort of close off with some that we're currently doing, and I certainly don't know all of them. I know about some of them. And then just a couple hints or suggestions for anyone who want to come up our way and how it might be best to do that. So we have a map of our territory. Most of our land is in the northern part of Labrador, and it includes the very northern part is the National Park, Torngat Mountains National Park. Most of the Labrador Inuit land is closer to the 5 communities of in the south, Riglet, Makovic, Postville, Hopedale, and Nain. And then we have another category of land called settlement area land, where we have hunting and fishing rights. We have rights for agreements if the development's over a certain size. And so our LIA was to start the process was formed in 1973, and in 77 we filed our claim. In 88 we started negotiations. We had a ratification process in 2003, majority vote then in 2004. The agreement signed in 05, and we actually formed our government in 2006. In terms of the Nunatsiavut Government, it's a regional form of self-government. It's a distinct level of government. It's in some ways similar to the federal and provincial and municipal. We're guided by our constitution, and we're responsible for key areas including operation and maintenance of programs and services, budgets, employment. We have an assembly that's elected, and we have a president that's elected by all of our beneficiaries. We have about 7,000 beneficiaries in Canada, and that have a right to vote, and about 7,000 beneficiaries. Anyone over 16 can vote, and they elect a president. We have a first minister who's also ordinary member for one of the communities, but basically each community gets one representative in our assembly. If you're a larger community like Nain or say Upper Lake Melville around Goose Bay, then you would get 2 representatives. Because we have a large membership in other parts of Canada, we also have representatives from other parts of Canada in our assembly as well. And then we have the 5 we call Anoat, that's the mayors of the communities. They sit in the assembly as well, so it gives us that connection to the community, and they have a vote the same as any other assembly members. And because we have a large population in Happy Valley, Upper Lake Melville area, we have 2 capital corporations, 2 crown corporations, or community corporations, and the chair of those corporations sit in our assembly, and they have a vote as well. So altogether we have 18 people sitting there. The Inuit community governments is similar in structure and roles to the former municipal governments, but in our agreement we have the opportunity to give them additional powers. Okay, and that has started to happen, and it will happen with time. So, for example, if we take control of an airport in a community, that's something we can negotiate down from the government, federal government, provincial government. We can then pass that on to the community government if we want. They're funded by the Nunatsiavut Government, and as I mentioned, Anoat sit in the assembly. I'll just very quickly go through our departments. We have 7 departments. We started in 2006 with 5. We've since moved up to 7. So we have Nunatsiavut Affairs, Secretariat, Nunatsiavut Affairs, Education, the most important department, Education and Economic Development, Health and Social Development, Lands and Natural Resources, Culture, Recreation, Tourism, Finance and Human Resources. And just briefly a little bit on each of them. The Nunatsiavut Secretary is mandated to serve the needs of Labrador Inuit, responsible for intergovernmental affairs, working of the Executive Council, Communications, and the staff includes the president, the secretary to the executive council, senior negotiators, our director of communications. We have community liaison officers in the communities, and we have a resource center. So there's more staff than that, but that's the primary ones. The Nunatsiavut Affairs is responsible for overseeing the running of the government, advocate for beneficiaries and running of the government. It's under the direction of the First Minister, and primarily it's responsible for ensuring the implementation of the claim. Because you'll probably know that when you get any agreement with government, it's almost as much work making the agreement work as it is getting the agreement. So it's not something we just get an agreement and it works. It takes time and energy and effort. So that department is responsible for making sure that both federal and provincial government lives up to their obligations. They're also responsible for legal services, community justice, public property, housing, transportation, beneficiary registration. And Lands and Natural Resources, Lands and Natural Resources are responsible for all matters related to the Nunatsiavut Government role in co-managing both renewable and non-renewable resources, and strives to gain maximum benefit while minimizing the impact on human well-being. And again, the most important department strives to foster a positive climate and attempts to provide long-term economic stability for Nunatsiavut and the beneficiaries of the claim, and responsible for the post-secondary student support program. That's the program Lucy oversees, as well as Anoat pathways, as well as all of the economic development initiatives. And our Department of Health and Social Development, as with most governments in Canada, provincial governments in Canada, it's the largest department. Health and Social Development is always the largest department in any government. They have an administrative office located outside of Nunatsiavut, mandated to improve the health and social well-being of Labrador Inuit, with emphasis placed on ensuring healthy individuals, families, also responsible for status of women. Culture, recreation, and tourism, and I want to spend more time on the latter part of my presentation, so I'll leave it at that. Finance, human resources, and information technology, fairly important department because that's where our paycheck comes from. So they're fairly important as well. If I can just say, the second part I'd like to talk a little bit now is about some of the past engagements with Memorial. And in a way, we've had a long, I would say we've had a long engagement with Memorial. Engagement with Memorial is not really new for us. It hasn't always been what we wanted it to be, and we're hoping that in the future things will get better and will improve. There's always room for improvement. But I wanted to make reference to MUN Extension, because some people would be familiar with the University Extension Services that was in place many years ago. And that, in essence, was the university reaching out for the communities. And I wanted to talk about charter development because in Inuit and Labrador, in Northern Labrador, economy was, a lot of the economy was based, for a while, was based on the salt fish products, okay? Same as in Newfoundland, salt fish. In our region, it wasn't only salt fish, it was salt char. And for Inuit in Labrador, salt char was extremely important because instead of sitting back home on welfare, people could go back, they would move north in their boats, they'd move north, big migration north, and they would put out their nets, they would live on the land, they'd get polar bear, they'd get seals, they'd get char, they'd get ducks, they'd get geese, they'd have all the food they needed, and they'd earn some money so they could get EI stamps and have some money coming in for the winter. Okay, with the failure of the salt fish markets across the world, and the Inuit suddenly didn't have means for employment, okay? And the university, with some support from the provincial government, came in. It was actually the Fisheries College in conjunction with MUN Extension Services, and they came in and they talked to people about the idea of freezing fish. And that was a pretty foreign concept. I mean, Inuit knew about salting fish, but the idea of freezing fish, they only froze them in the winter. How can you freeze fish in the summer? Okay, and so actually it revived the whole fishery. And you had people that for a number of years had been on welfare, all the social problems that goes with that, and suddenly you had those people, it was revitalized again. And they were moving back into their homeland, they were, again, earning money so they could take care of their families. So the university was a major partner in that. And no, that fishery is pretty well gone again now because with the advent of char farms, it's really challenging to compete. So we're looking again now at what do we need to do to revitalize it. And it'll be something that looks a bit different. It might be related to tourism. I'm not sure, but it's certainly something we're having some discussion with. We've raised it with Memorial, with the Fisheries Marine Institute, and we're looking forward to how we'll move on that one. I wanted to mention video communications because I went to high school at a residential school in North East River, which is in central Labrador. I went there in September, and I didn't get to go home until June. Okay, and there was no telephones. So every Friday, my father would call me on the radio. I would go to the hospital in the little back room, and my father would call me on the radio telephone. And he would say, "How are you doing, Tim?" Over. And then I would say, "I'm okay," over. Okay? And that was our communication every Friday. And some people from university came in, Memorial University Extension came in, and they had these huge containers, huge boxes. And they had video cameras in them, and they had, I mean, what you can hold in one hand today then took numerous boxes to fill. But they had this equipment, and you could make a video, you could make a movie of yourself, okay? So they taught us how to set up the cameras, how to record ourselves. We was each allowed to go into the library and record our own message back to our parents. And I made a message to send back to my mom and dad so they could see me. And when the equipment went to Mukovic, my home community, mom and dad went into a private space and saw the movie of me. And not only that, they made their movie and sent back to me. That was wonderful, but the other thing it did is it taught us young people how to use that equipment. And then we were able to make videos about the housing in our communities and about some of the social problems and about how much the stuff cost in the store. And we were able to use that as a means of getting the message out. So it was a form of empowerment. And that was one extension, okay? So very simple things, but yet it meant a lot. There was sociological research which helped us understand what was happening in our communities. And then a bit later on, we had the teacher education diploma program. We worked closely with Memorial on that, as well as the social work diploma. But for a little while, then in the 80s, we had a little bit of a lull, and it seemed that the university had kind of disappeared. And it wasn't just the university's fault. I think it was partly us. We were maybe on a different tangent as well. I should mention that the Marine Institute, we've always had a close connection to the Marine Institute. In particular, Gerald Anderson, as some people would know Gerald Anderson. He's always traveling everywhere, and he's always at all the functions. And he couldn't be here, so he asked me to come. And my back was bad, but I said, I've got to do this for Gerald because he's always done so much for me. But through Gerald, we've been able to get a lot of training in our communities, like for fisheries training, the Fishing Master 4, the Marine Emergency Duties, ship safety. Some of the discussions that we're having on CHAR is actually Gerald's been helping us on that. There were other things through the university, like the Nunatsiavut language work in Riglet. And the reason I'm mentioning these things, I'll tell you why I'm mentioning them after, okay? But people like Alana John did quite a bit of work for us in Riglet on the Nunatsiavut dialect. It was a slightly different dialect, and we wanted to save it, we wanted to conserve it, so that maybe someday we can bring it back. We have Nunatsiavut in the other communities, but in Riglet it was a separate, different dialect, and we wanted to make sure we didn't lose that. For people who know Dr. Larry Felt, he's done a lot of work for us. Some of that work now is just coming in real handy with the current ban on the George River caribou herd. He's helped us put together research that looked at what our use was in the past. So when we're trying to, as the herd comes back and we start looking at Labrador Inuit domestic harvest levels, that information will be useful. Dr. Natcher, when he was with the university as well, I'm not sure if I'm never sure if it's Derek Wilkinson or Derek Wilkins. I think it's Derek Wilkins has done from the geology department has done a lot of work. I want to recognize Martha as well, and from the Labrador Institute in Happy Valley, and it may seem like a kind of a small project, but Martha worked with the community on putting together a book on one of the Inuit myths around Nain, and the myth was about. When something bad happens, sometimes you will see a rock in the community, from the community, that it looks like it's changing, it changes color, it looks like a polar bear, okay? And that's a myth I've always heard, and the community always heard. But Martha helped us put that into a little storybook that the kids can use. And we can sell it in the store when tourists come in, okay? So it helps with tourism. So it sounds like kind of a simple thing, but actually it helps, it gives something for tourism for when people come to the communities. I wanted to mention, so I mentioned a little bit of a law, but Then Dr. Meissen, when Dr. Meissen came on as president of the university, we met with him in Goose Bay. I know myself and a few people from the Labrador Inuit Association met with Dr. Meissen, and he seemed really interested. But after he came home, he was back here for about 5 or 6 months, and we hadn't heard from him, and it seemed like nothing was happening. So I called my president and I said, well, don't you call Dr. Meissen and invite him to Nain? And you know, that's what made the difference. Dr. Meissen came to Nain, and after he came to Nain, that's when we started to work on the Aboriginal Task Force. And that's, there was a study done in Labrador. From the study came the Aboriginal Task Force. And I'm not sure how many people are familiar with the task force, but there's a lot of recommendations in there. Dr. Moira Hanrahan has been hired to make sure the recommendations are put in place. And there's a lot of work the university is doing that we're now starting to see the benefit of. And that sort of came from Dr. Meissen's visit. Now, it was Dr. Kachanowski that kept it moving, and he's a wonderful person for Labrador. He's done a lot of good for us, and his heart is in the right place, and we look forward to keeping the good relationship there. But so the task force, I wanted to mention the Anoat Bachelor social work program, which we've done with Memorial. We started some development with McGill, and then transferred eventually over to Memorial. Lucy was in charge of putting that in place, and Ellen Oliver, and but we've done all of the training in Labrador. It's all Inuit specific training. It trains Inuit for working in the communities, and we started, I think, Lucy, with 19 students, and we'll be graduating 17 near the end of April. Yeah, so that's a pretty good record. 17. I don't think you can do that on campus. No. I wanted to mention Dr. Tom Gordon and the School of Music and the work that he's been able to do in the community. I think some people may have seen the presentation from Dr. Bell on sustainable communities, the work we're doing with him on researching Lake Millville now because of the Muskrat Falls project. But there's much more to do, and there's a lot more to come. We're looking at more small business development. We have some more staff in my division of economic development now, and we're looking at more small business development, so we'll be looking for some help. I've taken in some of Tom's presentations, and we'll be looking forward to talking some more about that. Ice conditions in Labrador, and especially in the Riglet area. We see Riglet as a potential ice-free port, but we need some more work done on that. Sealskin tanning using more natural processes, so maybe there's some chemists at Memorial might be interested in working with us on that. The Sustainable Community Initiative with Dr. Bell is working on, there's still a lot of work to be done there. I had to mention specifically Labrador Institute. We do have a lot of resources now in Labrador, a lot of people resources because of Labrador Institute. We've got people in the aquatic area, people in the health area, a lot of good people. Dr. Northcott, Chris Northcott is here. He's working on important things in Labrador. I want to just put a plug in as well for our research station. We have a research station at Saglac, which is north of Nain, and it's a real world-class facility. It's the same place as we have the base camp for the park. So we have in the summer months we'll have a fair number of people there, but we have a research station there where eventually we'll have all of the equipment that researchers would need. We can provide support for researchers coming in. I'll just mention I guess a couple of hints, and one that I don't have here is I mentioned a number of pieces of research, or a number of researchers like Dr. Bell and Dr. Felt. I think if anyone is interested in working in our territory, one of the quite easy things you can do is you've got a resource on campus here that you can talk to. So you can just drop by and see Dr. Bell and ask him how he got involved. You can come and ask us and talk to us as well, but we're a telephone call away. He's just in the office next to you, okay? And he'll tell you firsthand from his perspective what some of the challenges were. And no doubt there is challenges, but most times it's interesting challenges. I think coming to visit makes a lot of difference. We had a Memorial Presents workshop in Nain, and we had quite a number of people from Memorial come up and do presentations. That was really useful. Again, communicating and setting up a dialogue, engage. I think getting an understanding of our territory and what's happening in our territory is helpful as well. So my main point is really to come on up. come up and visit us. We're not that far away. It may look a little bit far on the map, but really not that far away. Come up and see us and we'll talk. And that's it.
Thank you very much for the invitation here to speak today about engaging with Aboriginal communities. My name is Tom Cooper. I'm an assistant professor in the Faculty of Business Administration here at Memorial. Every time I speak about Aboriginal issues or Aboriginal economic development and business development, which I spend most of my time, I always acknowledge the fact that they were here first, and it's an honor and a privilege to always work with Aboriginal communities and Aboriginal people and talk to them about in terms of how they're dealing with the issues and how the opportunities and risks in their communities as well. I'm not Aboriginal. 6 years ago, 2 months and 11 days when I started here at Memorial, I had come from the industry. I'd done my PhD early, and I'd worked in banking, consulting for the most part in London, England. And when I moved back home, because we're townies, we're so much townies, our cabin's still out in paradise, which is, yeah, sometimes get a laugh, sometimes it doesn't. But it's true, it's up in Triampon, I've been there 65 years. I was looking around and I had this expertise in banking and insurance, and the Harris Center called me up one day and said, because I knew Rob, because we'd done our PhD in the same place, and he said, Tom, this Aboriginal group from Nova Scotia wants to speak to you about developing a bank, a pan-Atlantic bank for Aboriginal peoples. And I said, sure, let's have a chat. And that's become a major focus of my research since, and that group was called the Nunatsiavut Development Corporation. You sometimes see their ads. They do developmental lending. We eventually, through a very large study, we kind of realized that a bank wasn't the best way to go. A credit union was maybe beyond the capacity right now, and there was while there's been really good credit unions, especially in the western part of the country, wasn't something necessarily that would work here in Atlantic. And then from there, I went on to a fisheries project, and I've done a lot of most of my work is here on the island in terms of Mi'kmaq, which is, most people know as Conn River, and as well as the Halibu First Nation, which is forming out here in the west coast. So I've had a really interesting and really enlightening 6 years studying this, and it's hopefully something I can take some lessons learned and talk a little bit in terms of how you engage and think about engaging. And I'm still learning every time I do a project. And when Rob Greenwood said, Tom, would you like to speak on this? I said, surely there must be better people here at the university. And he said, no, at least you can tell about what went right and what went wrong along the way. So when you're looking at Aboriginal communities, I would say the first thing you have to remember, they're the same as other communities, but they're also different. Tim was totally right. When I started doing my work here, I went to speak to Larry Felt, and Larry Felt told me this. He said, Tom, you have to be aware of that, is that 90% or 80% of the issues, depending on the same thing, is the same as any other community in rural Newfoundland and Labrador, but it's also different. Also, when we talk about communities, it's not necessarily the physical communities. It can be a community of economic development officers. It can be a community of fisheries officers that are all Aboriginal. So once again, it's always that distinction that I find within Aboriginal communities. It's also communities of people, not necessarily just a physical community. So you may be engaging with Aboriginal economic development officers, but also specific geographical communities such as Member 2 in Cape Breton. Same as other communities. The issues that you're dealing with, if you're going in, once again, to rural Newfoundland and Labrador, are a lot of times very similar in terms of there's sometimes mistrust, there's sometimes a lot of respect because you're coming from a university environment, which always floors me coming from industry, which was the other way around. There are risks as well. I remember speaking to an elder from New Brunswick, and we were sitting around a table, and he said, "You're from the university, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes, sir, I am." And he goes, "You took my hair in 1955 and I want it back." And he was vehement, and I was going, "Excuse me?" And he said, no, you took my hair for testing in the university and I want it back." And I said, well, first of all, I know I look really young, but I made my ages, but I wasn't born in 1955. But but what he told me, no, I'm just joking. What I want to tell you is that you have to respect our rights and the way that we do things. And just because we've had some bad experiences in the past, and when you go into Aboriginal communities, one of the things that I'm always told is that we are the most studied, every community, always the same thing. We are over-studied, we are over-researched, and you have to be respectful in terms of how to operate within that. There's obviously affected by external and socioeconomic trends. There's also enablers and barriers, because once you get into these communities, it's incredible the type of work that you can do and how fascinating that is, both as a researcher and as someone who's involved in doing economic and business development. And there's going to be challenges and risks. It's interesting. One of the things I always say, if you're a young researcher, do not touch this field. It is scary, because you will not get promotion and tenure unless you can demonstrate that you can do research and publish research on this. One of the things I notice in Aboriginal communities, and once again, it may be different in different fields, but in business and in management, what we have is that we have to publish papers. And in Aboriginal communities, time is a little bit different, shall we say. So if you're expecting to go to a meeting at 9 o'clock in the morning, you may be waiting a while. And if you expect to get a project done in 3 months, and that's what you've budgeted, you may be looking at 9 months, 10 months. So your timelines are much, much different, and that poses risks, because you always want to try and get into be a mutually beneficial research and engagement relationship. So it's going to benefit the community, and it's going to benefit you as well. And there's going to be failures, and I've had, in the 6 years, I've had some failures as projects, and I've had some great successes, and sometimes they're the same thing. So once again, how are they different? You have to, as Tim was indicating, these are all nations, and it's really interesting when I've been talking to Chief and Council in Mi'kmaq and in Alibu. That's one of the things that we always try and talk about, is that they are a nation, just like Canada, just like a municipal government. Just because they're a small community and they have a different ethnic background, that doesn't mean that they're the same. They are different, and one of the things for me, it's like doing international business in your own backyard. The importance of politics, one of the things, as from an engagement standpoint, I was told by my research assistants when I was working in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia looking at their commercial fishing industry, never ever go into a community during an election. And I said, why? Well, because you don't want to have your project being used for political means. You want to try and keep it independent from there. The spiritual and cultural knowledge, and I've published some papers on looking at risk management and spiritual and cultural risk, is very, very important, and it's one of those elements that you always consider when any time you're engaging with Aboriginal communities. Indigenous elders knowledge as well. The importance of elders and speaking to elders and getting the knowledge of elders is really, really important. I always, in academia, there's that whole element of I've consulted with people and therefore it's okay. As Tim was indicating, that notion of consent is also really important. So you have to be, if you're going to go into a community, there is protocols in terms of coming in. You just can't say, hi, I'm coming next week, I'll see you then, i.e. you consulted with them. Instead, you have to say, I'm coming next week, can I come? And I think that's a really important element. And overall, I think there's a sense of distrust of authority figures. I was doing a lot of work with the Aboriginal fisheries for about 2 years in Atlantic Canada. And every time I went in, no offense to Jeff Coughlin was sitting in the room, but I had to tell them I wasn't DFO. And they were petrified that I was DFO and I was going to come and I was going to give some information and all those sorts of elements. Explaining every time and giving them assurance that I was here to do research. I was doing it as an independent third party. I wasn't going to develop a report that was going to take their boats away or their resources away and all those sorts of elements. So that becomes really, really important, because there has been those cases over the last 100 years. And so there is a sense of distrust of authority figures. These are some diagrams that I used in a paper that was published with one of my, I'll talk about the use of trusted third parties, but one of the people that the Harris Center hooked me up with is a consultant by the name of Terry Hickey, who runs a consultancy that predominantly deals work with Aboriginal communities and with Halibu and with Mi'kmaq. But we talked about in terms of how do stakeholders engage with Aboriginal communities. And whether you're a corporation or an NGO or your university or government, when you're looking, there's basically three sorts of risks. There's always a risk to the project. So a lot of times in this world, whether you're in a university or whether you're in a business or whether you're in a government department, you have a specific time frame, and that time frame is really defined by the project. The project is always very much different in terms of, and you have to make sure that it's very well defined. The spiritual and the cultural elements are also incredibly important, and that whole element of making sure that that's managed becomes an element of well. The time element, one of the things as a researcher, you always want to own the data, you want to always be able to publish the data, you always want to be able to get credit within a university environment for the work that you do. The problem sometimes is that the notion of ownership in an Aboriginal context is different. So what I found is that, I went out and did 125 interviews with all these Aboriginal fishermen, got great data, great things that I could publish, and I was told, yeah, we're not really comfortable because of some of the findings, blah, blah, blah. So I kind of wasted 2 years of my life from an academic standpoint. That's okay. Hopefully it works out. But the ownership element, becomes, for tenure at least it is. The control element is important as well. One of the things is that if I'm going into a small to medium-sized business here and doing research, a lot of times I'm the person in control. I'm setting up the research parameters. I'm talking in terms of what's going on. What I find in an Aboriginal context, there's shared control. And if not, sometimes it's control led by them. And then the whole idea of how you do the governance. So setting up advisory committees, doing all the good things that engagement helps you to do, makes the project goes very, very well. And then obviously you have to be clear in terms of accountability. Where is this project going? What is it going to be used for? How is it going to benefit the community? How is it going to benefit the Aboriginal and Indigenous peoples? And at the same thing, you have to be transparent in terms of, well, this is what I'm trying to get out of it. I'm trying to develop a better relationship with your community so that at some point I can do some further research. I'm also want to maybe publish some papers on this with your permission, etc. So that transparency and accountability becomes really, really important. So understanding the notion of consent, understanding participation, and understanding control all kind of tie in together in terms of looking at Indigenous stakeholder management, which to me is effectively engagement. So you're understanding that you need to have consent before you go into communities. You need to talk and say, this is what we're trying to do, and understands whether it's the ethics protocols or understand just what the community is interested in. You may be really interested in talking to them about financing and economic development, but they may be more interested in saying, how do we make our fisheries better? And understanding where that comes from as well. The participation, every time I'm always really keen on using research assistants who are in the community, who are understand the community, and can give me that local knowledge that I cannot develop in 6 months or a year, even 2 years that I'm there. But making sure that people can participate, and anybody who wants to come speak to me while I'm there can. I remember being in Member 2, and I had this, which is in Cape Breton, which is seen nationally as one of the best case examples of governance. They use ISO principles in terms of their corporate reporting, etc. And this grandmother wanted to come talk to me about who I was and the fact that I was from Newfoundland, Labrador. I was on a tight time frame, but she wanted to come talk to me. So I was there for about an hour, having a chat about kids, having a cup of tea, and a couple of people were waiting outside the room that we had arranged. But once again, there was a participation. So everybody who was in the community, they heard me, they wanted to come speak to me. And then the control, about, as I mentioned before, looking at the governance, the ownership, and the ratios as well. So I use the word corporation. Sorry, once again, this was published looking at businesses, but I think you can talk about being university-led. I think this notion of participation and engagement is really about, once again, trying to get to that sweet spot in the middle where it's very participatory, where it's driven by consent, recognition of risks, management of opportunities, rather than just being, once again, something that just an Indigenous population wants, or just something that the university wants as well. So ultimately, some of the good practices, you're focusing on the mutual benefits. I think my real benefit that's gotten through me is use of trusted third parties, whether they're consultants, whether they're banks. I do some work with BDC, who has a really good relationship with a number of different communities there. It takes time. It's not something, once again, as a young researcher, I would necessarily recommend to somebody who's walking in the door. What may take 6 months here in St. John's may take a year, just in terms of travel and recognizing, once again, with weather and all those sorts of elements as well. Relationship-based engagement, once you get into it, I think it's something you have to be really committed to. And it's something that I really enjoy now, but it takes time. And recognize the cultural and spiritual elements, once again, is really, really important. It's different, especially in the business world, where sometimes we're just looking at dollars and cents and the efficiency and effectiveness of processes. I think sometimes you have to take a step back and say, well, what does this really mean from a cultural and spiritual element? And participatory. And there's lots of really interesting research methodologies that I've learned really doing work with these communities, whereas participatory action research, where you're doing research with rather than on. So thank you very much. I think I met the time almost right on. Very happy to answer any questions. And